Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest. I never thought I'd find myself here, at 58 years old, sitting on the edge of my velvet armchair in my quaint seaside cottage, a steaming mug of chamomile tea cradled in my hands, staring out at the waves crashing against the rocky shore. The salty breeze slipped through the cracked window, carrying with it the faint scent of seaweed and the distant cry of gulls. Some moments in life etch themselves so deeply into your soul that no amount of time can blur their edges. They remain as vivid, as raw, as the day they happened. That night, 3 months ago, was one of those moments. It was the night that upended the quiet, predictable rhythm I'd settled into. A night that forced me to confront feelings I'd long buried, feelings I thought I'd outgrown. My name is Clara Whitmore, and for the past 15 years, I've worked as the personal assistant to Edward Langston, the director of a prestigious art gallery in the bustling coastal city of Port Haven. Edward was the kind of man who commanded respect without ever raising his voice. Tall, with a mane of salt and pepper hair, piercing blue eyes that seemed to see through everything, and a quiet intensity that made you feel both seen and slightly unsteady. He was 60, 2 years my senior, but carried himself with the vigor of a man a decade younger. In all our years working together, he'd been nothing but professional. Kind, yes, but always maintaining a careful distance. I admired him, respected him, and if I'm honest, relied on him as a steady anchor in my otherwise solitary life. After my husband passed away 12 years ago, I'd thrown myself into work, convincing myself that companionship, romance, all of that was behind me. Until that night. It began with an email, late on a Thursday afternoon, as I sat at my desk in the gallery's back office, surrounded by stacks of exhibition catalogs and the faint hum of the air conditioning. The subject line was simple: dinner tonight. I blinked at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, a ripple of unease stirring in my chest. Edward's message was brief. Clara, I'd like to take you to dinner tonight. I have something important to discuss. My treat. Let me know if you're free. I reread it 3 times, each word sinking heavier into my mind. Dinner? With Edward? We'd worked late countless times, often sharing takeout in the office while finalizing exhibition plans. But this was different. This was an invitation, a deliberate step outside our usual routine. My first instinct was to decline. I didn't like surprises, and this felt like the prelude to one. But curiosity, that restless little spark, tugged at me. What could be so important that it couldn't be discussed here, in the familiar confines of the gallery? I typed back before I could second-guess myself. I'm free. What time and where? His reply came almost instantly. 7:00 p.m. at the Sapphire Room. I'll meet you there. My breath caught in my throat. The Sapphire Room wasn't just any restaurant. It was a haven of elegance, tucked away on a cliff overlooking the ocean, known for its candlelit tables, live violin music, and a menu so exclusive you needed a reservation weeks in advance. A nervous flutter bloomed in my stomach as I shut down my computer and gathered my things. Was this about work? A new project, perhaps? Or, my mind hesitated to even entertain the thought, was he planning to retire? The idea of Edward leaving the gallery, leaving me, sent a pang of dread through my chest. He wasn't just my boss, he was my constant, my tether to a world I'd built after losing so much. By the time I arrived at the Sapphire Room, my nerves were a tangled mess. I'd chosen a simple navy dress, the fabric soft against my skin, and let my silver-streaked hair fall loose around my shoulders, a small rebellion against my usual tightly pinned bun. The hostess led me to a secluded table by a floor-to-ceiling window where the ocean stretched out endlessly, its surface shimmering under the moonlight. Edward was already there, standing as I approached, his tailored charcoal suit accentuating his broad shoulders. There was something different about him tonight, a restless energy in the way he adjusted his cufflinks, the way his eyes softened as they met mine. "You look stunning, Clara," he said, his voice warm, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. I felt a flush creep up my neck, unaccustomed to such direct compliments from him. "Thank you," I replied, smoothing my dress as I sat, trying to mask the tremor in my hands. "I hope this isn't about the budget for the spring exhibition. I was really hoping for a night off from numbers. My attempt at humor felt forced, but Edward chuckled, the sound low and reassuring, though his eyes held a depth I couldn't quite read. "No, it's not about work," he said, his gaze steady. "At least, not entirely." The waiter arrived with a bottle of wine, my favorite, a crisp Pinot Grigio I'd once mentioned in passing years ago. My stomach flipped. How did he remember that? We clinked glasses, the crystal chiming softly, and for a while the conversation flowed easily. We laughed over old stories, mishaps at gallery openings, the time a client spilled champagne on a priceless painting. But beneath the lightness, I felt a tension building, a shift in the air I couldn't ignore. Finally, after the plates were cleared and the violinist began a haunting melody, Edward leaned forward, his expression serious, his voice dropping to a low, intimate tone. "Clara, I need to ask you something, and I don't want you to feel pressured. I just want your honest answer." My heart thudded against my ribs, a heavy, unsteady rhythm. I nodded, unable to speak, my fingers tightening around the stem of my glass. "I'm stepping down as director at the end of the year," he said, and my chest constricted, a hollow ache spreading through me. I'd suspected this might be coming, but hearing it confirmed felt like a rug being pulled out from under me. Edward had been my rock for 15 years. How would I navigate the gallery without him? But before I could process the news, he continued, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. "But that's not why I asked you here tonight." I froze, my breath catching as he reached across the table, his hand covering mine. His touch was warm, steady, but it sent a jolt through me, a spark I hadn't felt in years. "I've spent the last few months thinking about what comes next for me," he said, his blue eyes searching mine with an intensity that made my pulse race. "And the more I think about it, the more I realize there's someone I don't want to leave behind when I walk away from that gallery." My mind reeled, the room tilting slightly as his words sank in. "Clara," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I don't just admire you. I care about you, more than I probably should." He let out a soft, self-deprecating laugh, shaking his head. "I never said anything before because I didn't want to cross that line. But now, as I look at the years ahead, I realize I don't want them to be without you." The world seemed to shrink, the clinking glasses and murmured conversations fading into a distant hum. All I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. All I could feel was the warmth of his hand on mine. Edward, my boss, my friend, the man I'd worked beside for 15 years, was telling me he cared for me, that he wanted more than our professional relationship. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. I was 58 years old. Romance wasn't something I'd considered in over a decade. After my husband's death, I'd locked that part of myself away, convinced it was gone for good. And yet, sitting here, looking into Edward's eyes, I felt something stir, a flicker of fear, yes, but also something else, something I hadn't let myself feel in years. "Edward, I don't know what to say," I admitted, my voice trembling, my fingers twitching under his. He squeezed my hand gently, his expression softening. "You don't have to say anything right now," he said, his voice a soothing balm against the storm in my chest. I've waited too long to tell you this, Clara, and I don't want to waste any more time." Time. That word hung between us, heavy with meaning. At 58, I wasn't a woman who dreamed of whirlwind romances or grand gestures. My life was steady, predictable, safe. And now, in the middle of an elegant restaurant, with the ocean glittering outside and a violin weeping in the background, the man I'd known as my boss was asking me to consider something that could change everything. I pulled my hand back, needing space to breathe, to think. "Edward, I never thought about you that way," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You've always been my boss, my friend." "I know," he said, his smile tinged with a quiet sadness. "And maybe that's my fault. Maybe I should have let you see me as more than that a long time ago." I reached for my glass, the cool wine doing little to calm the heat rising in my chest. "You've caught me off guard," I said, my fingers trembling slightly. "This is a lot to take in." "I understand." He nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. "But tell me one thing, Clara. When you think about your life outside of work, do you ever think about yourself? About what you want? Or have you just accepted that this is all there is? His words hit me like a wave, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. When was the last time I'd thought about my own happiness, my own desires? My marriage had ended in death, not betrayal, but the slow erosion of grief had left me hollow. I'd rebuilt my life around work, around routine, telling myself I didn't need more. And now, for the first time in years, someone was asking me what I wanted. I don't know, I admitted, my voice cracking with vulnerability. Edward leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Then maybe it's time to find out, he said softly. The waiter arrived with the bill, and Edward paid before I could protest. As we stood to leave, he placed a hand on the small of my back, the touch light but warm, sending an unexpected shiver through me. I don't want an answer tonight, he said as we stepped outside into the crisp night air, the ocean breeze tugging at my hair. I just want you to think about it. I nodded, my mind still spinning, my heart a tangled mess of fear and longing. I will, I said, my voice barely audible. He smiled, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than necessary. Good night, Clara. Good night, Edward, I replied, watching as he walked to his car, his silhouette disappearing into the darkness. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay in bed, the moonlight streaming through my window, casting silver patterns on the ceiling. My mind replayed every moment of the evening, the way Edward's voice had softened when he spoke my name, the warmth of his hand on mine, the way my pulse had quickened when he touched me. Had I truly never thought of him in that way? Or had I buried those feelings so deep I'd refused to acknowledge them? The questions swirled, relentless, keeping me awake until the first light of dawn crept through the curtains. The next morning, I arrived at the gallery early, hoping to find some semblance of normalcy in my routine, but as I stepped into my office, I froze. A single red rose sat on my desk, its petals vibrant against the stark white of my planner, still glistening with morning dew. There was no note, no explanation, but I didn't need one. I knew who had left it. My fingers hovered over the delicate petals, my heart pounding as I sat down, the familiar space suddenly feeling charged with something new, something unsteady. I was still staring at the rose when I heard a soft knock at my door. Morning. Edward's voice was warm, steady, but there was a hint of uncertainty in it. I turned to face him, my breath catching as I met his gaze. He stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, a quiet intensity in his blue eyes. Morning, I replied, my voice softer than I intended. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a gentle click. Did you get my gift? He asked, his eyes flickering to the rose. I nodded, my fingers twisting together in my lap. I did, I said, my voice trembling slightly. And I don't know what you expect me to say, Edward. He gave a small smile, moving to sit across from me, his presence filling the room. I don't expect anything, Clara, he said, his voice gentle. I just want to know what's going through your mind. I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. Honestly, I feel like my whole world shifted last night, I admitted, my voice raw with emotion. For 15 years, I've seen you as my boss, my friend, and now you're asking me to see you differently. He nodded, his gaze steady, unwavering. Is that such a bad thing? He asked, his voice soft but probing. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out, because the truth was, I didn't know. Edward leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes searching mine. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, Clara, he said, his voice earnest. That's the last thing I'd ever want, but I can't pretend I don't feel this way, not anymore. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding as I looked away, staring out the window at the city below. The ocean stretched out in the distance, its surface glittering under the morning sun, a reminder of the vast possibilities I'd never let myself consider. What exactly are you asking me for, Edward? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His expression softened, a quiet vulnerability in his eyes. A chance, he said simply. A chance for you to see if maybe there's something here. If maybe, just maybe, you could feel the same way. I looked away, my fingers tightening in my lap, my mind a whirlwind of fear and longing. Could I really do this? Could I take the risk? I don't know, I admitted, my voice trembling with uncertainty. I don't know if I can just change how I see you, Edward. He didn't look disappointed. If anything, he looked patient, understanding. Then don't force it, he said softly. Let it happen naturally. I turned back to him, my breath catching at the sincerity in his eyes. And if it doesn't? I asked, my voice barely audible. He smiled, a real, genuine smile that made my chest ache. Then I'll still be here, no matter what, he said, his voice steady, unwavering. I exhaled, feeling some of the weight in my chest loosen, though the uncertainty still lingered. That's a dangerous promise, Edward, I said, a faint smile tugging at my lips. His eyes twinkled with a quiet mischief. I'm willing to take my chances, he replied, his voice warm with conviction. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake our conversation from my mind. I'd expected things to be awkward, tense, but they weren't. Edward carried on as if nothing had changed. He didn't push, didn't hover. And yet I felt his presence more acutely than ever. Every time he passed by my office, every time our eyes met across the gallery floor, every time his voice softened when he said my name, I felt it, a quiet pull, a spark I couldn't ignore. By the time the day ended, I was exhausted, not from work, but from the storm of emotions swirling inside me. As I gathered my things to leave, my phone buzzed with a message. Dinner tonight? Just dinner, no pressure. What do you say? Edward's words stared back at me, simple but loaded with meaning. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. I could say no, keep things as they were, safe, predictable, or I could take a step into the unknown. My heart pounded as I typed my response. Yes, where and when. The restaurant was a quiet, dimly lit bistro a few blocks from the gallery, its warm glow a stark contrast to the chilly evening air. I sat at the table, my fingers wrapped around the stem of my wine glass, watching the candlelight flicker as Edward sat across from me, his gaze steady, his presence a quiet comfort. If he was nervous, he didn't show it, but I was. I'd spent the entire day trying to talk myself out of coming, and yet here I was, sitting across from the man who had been my boss for 15 years, now seeing him in a way I never had before. Thank you for saying yes, Edward said, his voice warm, a faint smile playing on his lips. I smiled faintly, my fingers tightening around my glass. I almost didn't, I admitted, my voice tinged with nerves. He chuckled, the sound low and reassuring. I figured, he said, his eyes twinkling with understanding. I let out a breath, shifting in my seat, my heart still racing. I don't know what to do with this, Edward, I said, my voice raw with honesty. I don't know how to suddenly start seeing you differently. He nodded, taking a sip of his drink, his gaze never leaving mine. I'm not asking you to, he said softly. I just wanted tonight to be easy, just two people having dinner. I studied him, his words making it sound so simple, but nothing about this felt simple to me. And yet, as the night went on, I found myself relaxing. We talked about the gallery, about old exhibitions, about silly moments that made me laugh, and it felt natural. At one point, Edward leaned back in his chair, watching me closely, a quiet intensity in his eyes. I've missed this, he said, his voice soft, almost wistful. I arched a brow, a faint smile tugging at my lips. Missed what? I asked, my curiosity piqued. Seeing you like this, he said, his gaze warm, unwavering. You're always so serious at work, always taking care of everything and everyone. But here, right now, you're just you. I blinked, caught off guard by his words, a flutter stirring in my chest. I couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at me like that, really looked at me. The thought sent a warmth through me, unfamiliar and unexpected. After dinner, we stepped outside, the cool night air wrapping around us, the sound of the ocean a distant murmur. I was about to call a cab when Edward spoke, his voice soft but firm. Let me drive you home, he said, his eyes searching mine. I hesitated, the offer feeling like a line I shouldn't cross, but after a moment I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. The drive was quiet, comfortable, the hum of the engine a soothing backdrop to my swirling thoughts. When we pulled up to my cottage, Edward put the car in park and turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Clara?" he said softly, reaching over to take my hand, his touch warm, steady. "You don't have to say anything." I swallowed, my throat tight with emotion, my heart racing as I met his gaze. "But I do," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know where this goes, Edward. I don't know if I can give you what you're looking for." His thumb brushed lightly over my fingers, a gentle, reassuring gesture. "Then let's not rush," he said, his voice a quiet promise. "Let's just take it one step at a time." I let out a shaky breath, my heart pounding as I looked at him, really looked at him. For the first time, I let myself wonder, what if? Maybe this wasn't the end of something. Maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning. I squeezed his hand lightly before pulling away, reaching for the door handle. "Good night, Edward," I said, my voice soft but steady. He watched me, his gaze warm, patient. "Good night, Clara," he replied, his voice a quiet anchor in the storm of my emotions. As I stepped out and walked toward my front door, the warmth of his touch lingered on my skin, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something new, hope.